Well, good evening, Manchester. Hooks at Auburn. This is the progress report for this Wednesday, June 21st, the first day of summer, folks.
Summer solstice.
Yeah, the sunlight lasts longer today than any other day of the year. And that's kind of a sad thing to say because it's so nice to have.
It's all downhill from here, folks.
It's
We're
so
on our way
nice,
to winter.
It's so nice to exit this building after we have our good time doing this show and be able to drive home
in the daylight.
And then it comes winter and we can't even arrive here in the daylight. But that's what
all
you
right.
get for living at the 45th parallel, or almost.
43rd.
43rd.
43rd parallel.
Oh, very good.
I don't know why I know that, but
So tonight, folks, I am very, very pleased and very grateful to our guest, Kathy Rogers, who serves in the New Hampshire House, as you know I do, and who, although she's not on the Finance Committee, really knows.
Oh, I am.
Oh, you are on the Finance
I
Committee?
am on the Finance
I'm sorry.
Committee, yes.
Well,
oh boy, Bob did the background work today, didn't we? It's live
but
TV,
I
folks.
was
Forgive
going to
us.
say, without being on the Finance Committee, but she is on the Finance Committee, knows the ins and outs of the state budget as much as anybody does, I'm sure, including people that have had long service and worked on many budgets, and probably, Kathy, you worked on several too.
This is my third year on the Finance Committee, but you were right. I wasn't on the Conference Committee, but I am on the Finance
Yes,
Committee.
okay, that's right. And the budget vote will be tomorrow. It's apparently going to be a close vote. Nobody's entirely sure what's going to happen. But since the budget, as my good friend Lou D'Alessandro always reminds us, affects everybody in New Hampshire, we thought we should pick an expert to come and help us understand it and the many dimensions where it can affect our people, from the taxes we're going to levy to support the budget to the services we're going to provide, and then I'm afraid in some cases that we need but are not providing.
Budgets dictate policy.
Budget
You
dictates
can-
policy.
You can say all the words you want about one issue or another issue, but if you don't put money in the budget behind it,
Yeah.
it's nothing more than hot air.
Yeah, it's like they say about local planning, the real planners are the tax assessors. So, but, we've come to enjoy, since January 20th of this year, the new feature that Mike Farley brings to us every week, the POTUS report on the progress report. And by God, he found some material this week. It's hard to do that, isn't it?
It's not hard to do, except if you forget to do it. But we do. I do have a very brief POTUS report on the progress report this week, folks. I just wanted to kind of focus in on one particular aspect of this administration, this White House, and it has to do with secrecy. Most of us grew up in the era or have lived through the era of the Freedom of Information Act. And the idea that government should be done openly, sunlight is the best disinfectant, we've heard all of these things. And we know what the Freedom of Information Act is. It allows you to go and ask for government documents and find out what happened if you didn't happen to be there or if the public didn't happen to be there. Sometimes the government says, no, we don't want to give you these documents, but you can file a claim or a lawsuit and you can get them through a court action under the Freedom of Information Act. It's been a very, very important law that has provided for openness in our government. But it's only been around since about 1965, I think. Maybe it was 66. So while it seems to us like it's been around forever and government has always been open, it's a relatively new thing in the long scheme of things. And we are seeing how fragile that is in this administration. We're seeing a heck of a lot of secrecy in government. I think the best example we're seeing this week and last week is how the Senate is operating on the health care bill, which is going to affect 1/6 of the United States economy, not to mention the millions and millions of people and thousands of businesses, small and large, that provide or choose whether or not to provide health care to their employees, which is the main way that people in the United States get health care. Whether that makes sense or not is an issue for debate. But there's been a lot of people saying, well, the Obamacare bill, was passed with only Democrats, but that may be so, but that the Republicans were not aced out of the procedure. There were hearings. They were allowed to participate. Whatever they chose to do with their vote, that's a different story. In this case, no committee hearings, no witness testimony. only a handful, I think it's the numbers like 13 to 18 people even have any idea what's being discussed. There are many, there's 50 Republicans in the Senate. A majority of them have not even seen the bill. Some are concerned, some are not. But it's all being done in secret. The bill is going to be sprung in full adult form on Thursday, and we'll have a vote within a couple days. So that's what secrecy gets you. It's going to be it's going to be a purely political issue, not a policy issue. We look at the White House. The White House has discontinued public access to their visitor logs. No one knows who's going in and out of that White House to talk to the president, to peddle influence or whatever the case may be, or to talk to his daughter or his son-in-law. For public or private purpose, who knows? No one knows, and we can't find out. And it's very difficult if you can't even look at the log to file a Freedom of Information Act request for a meeting that you don't even know took place. Let's look at the White House press briefings. To the extent that they even had press briefings, the answers were usually, geez, I forgot to talk to the president about that, so I can't answer you. Or I'll have to get back to you, and then don't. Or I don't know. Or I don't accept the question.
My favorite was when the press asked him, does Donald Trump believe in human-caused climate change? Oh, I'll have to ask the president, but I haven't asked him. As far as I know, he still hasn't asked the president because we've never heard an answer.
Well, I would think a professional press secretary would have a clipboard with a list of questions that he thinks might come up, and that would have been on that list.
You would
he might
think.
get ready for his position. But,
Yeah.
I mean, that is diminishing, Bob, because the last press briefing they had, no cameras or audio allowed, and at this point, they've just basically discontinued having daily press briefings. Likewise with the State Department. State Department press briefings have dwindled to once or twice a week, whereas they used to be every single day. So the stuff's going on. It's not like they're taking those other days off and sleeping in. Stuff's going on, but we're not getting a chance to see it or even ask about it. And that is this week's POTUS report on the progress report.
Oh, very good. And you put that together in about 2 minutes, just before showtime.
You didn't have to tell everybody, Bob.
Well,
I work hard. I work all week on these things.
I thought it was very good.
Truth be told, though, Bob, you know what? I've spent time putting these things together, and then the night of the show, something crazy will happen, and
Yeah.
I've had to scrap the whole thing and come up with something really quick.
Yeah.
So this was not difficult. This is what I've had to do most of the time anyway.
You know, as you were talking about the machinations in secret for developing the Trump health care plan, or the Republican health care plan, to me, one of the most stunning things that Trump has said, and this is, a minefield of things he said that are just shocking, but was that after having the House pass that bill on the second try.
And having a party in the Rose Garden.
Having a party in the Rose Garden, like they'd actually accomplished something. Then this week he said it was mean. It was mean. Now, if you're a Republican that went all out, to pass this thing,
You mean
How do you
that
feel
Republican
about that?
standing at the end of the plank while the president saws it off at the boat? Is that the Republican you're talking about?
that was just the
Hey,
most
look,
amazing thing.
I don't count on guts from any of these guys. There's a few. Susan Collins, Rand Paul. Rand Paul's been sticking by his guns. He's got guts. But I look at a guy like Ted Cruz. Oh my God! After what he went through, and Marco Rubio, what they
Yeah.
went through in that primary, and they've just rolled for this guy. They've just rolled for him.
So that's a good progress report, POTUS report on the progress report. But now I want to introduce our guest, or perhaps let her introduce herself, because she'll do a better job of it than I will. I've already proven that. Kathy Rogers has been provided a lot of service to the people of New Hampshire in many capacities. She's been a prosecutor. She served in the House, and the Finance Committee is a real demanding assignment in the House for a long time. And tell us a little bit about yourself and
Okay.
what your life has been and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I served in the House first in the 90s as a representative from Concord. I served on the Public Works Committee and on the Criminal Justice Committee. Then I left and served as the Merrimack County Attorney and served as a prosecutor for some police departments. Then decided to, or was recruited to come back to the New Hampshire House. I fell for the line of, oh, you can serve on a committee that doesn't meet very often. You just do light duty. I think there was sucker written across my forehead, because when I came back and got elected, I ended up, as you said, on the Finance Committee. And the Finance Committee meets, generally speaking, 5 days a week and some weekends. And when I said days a week, it very often is from 9 to 7 or 8 o'clock, quite often. I think where you were confused earlier and said I wasn't on finance, I am on finance, but I didn't serve on the conference committee, so that's
Right.
where the difference is.
Could you take a second and just explain what the conference
The-
committee
yes.
is? I think
And
all
how
of it-
finance works, because I think there's some difference in, finance committee is different than any other committee in the House. We're kind of like we're very pampered, first of all. Most committees do not have staff. Most committees do not have member rooms. We have things like, we have a coffee pot, which other committees don't have. We have a microwave. We have little treats. We also have a member room. We have a full-time administrative assistant, where other committees share that. We get to have the services of the LBA, the Legislative Budget Assistant Office, which are miraculous people that work with us on a daily basis. They're a staff of a number of individuals that are wonderful people that actually staff us. So we do have staff, which other committees do not have. Finance is made up of 3 divisions. Division 3, I'll go backwards. I serve on Division 3. Division 3 covers Health and Human Services Department, which makes up roughly 45 to 50% of the state budget. It's where the money is, basically. Division 2, which covers transportation, it covers safety, and it covers education. And then Division 1 basically covers everything else, is the easy way of putting it. The divisions are split up, and that's how we split up the budget when it's in the House, into those 3 categories. And the budget, when it's presented, is done that way. We meet, starting in January, we first get some preliminary information from economists around the state, from various experts. We get briefings from every department in the state. Then when the governor presents his budget to the House and the Senate, which is usually late January, early February, we start going through hearings on the budget. Every department comes in. Well, first the governor presents his budget to us, does a briefing. Then every department comes in, and they go through grueling hearings. Interesting little side note, as I said, I'm on finance now. When I grew up, my mother was administrative assistant for the Department of Corrections. And I remember as a little girl, my mother coming home after having gone to the then Appropriations Committee and saying, "Oh my God," and complaining about the legislators. And at the time when she was there, which was 40 some odd years ago, representative that was the chairman of finance, I just remember her talking about him. He was a gentleman that was follically challenged, shall we say, had a long pointy nose. I just said follically challenged, and wore glasses, spectacles that he would have on the tip of his nose, and she would talk about him looking down his long pointy nose with his bald head and staring at her and asking horrible questions for a day long of hearings. So I'm always mindful when employees come in from the state and testify to us, and I try to be very polite. Even when I'm asking challenging questions, I try to remember what it was like being the daughter of somebody who had to go through this.
So when they complain around the dinner table, it
Right,
won't
that they're
be
not
about
talking
you.
about me. But it's different because you do have that perspective
Yeah.
of being a family member,
Very
what it was
interesting,
like
yeah.
when they come home from a day of being really attacked sometimes. Because there are
But
members.
that's part of the job.
It's
on
part of
both
the
sides
job.
of the table.
It is part of the job, but there are some legislators that go a little too far and don't remember these are individuals that are doing their job. By and large, I think our finance committee that we have is very respectful. But there are some legislators that do take it a little far and don't remember that these are individuals. But we do question people, and sometimes very intensely. Any legislator will tell you they go to hearings and they'll testify in front of committees, but it's different when you go to finance. First of all, we have the largest room in the building. When you come to finance, there's the full finance committee, which is 25 individuals, and then there's the separate divisions. But when you come in, it's the biggest room. It's the most grandiose room. We have a fireplace in there. It's very grandiose, and it's very intimidating. It's the only committee that has microphones that are on. We live stream a number of the hearings. There's always a large audience of lobbyists and individuals and stuff. So it's a much bigger thing when you go to the Finance Committee. And we also have a court stenographer that takes notes of these hearings so that you can get the records. Some committees, when there are big hearings, will do this on occasion. With Finance, it's all the time. So it's a much more intimidating process when you come there. So we go through the budget like this on these hearings and so forth, and then we start deliberations in each division. Each division makes recommendations, then it goes to the full Finance Committee. We also hold hearings throughout the state. This year there were hearings that were done, I think, in 4 different locations. We had hearings in, I believe it was in Derry, in I can't remember where in the northern part of the state. I think it was Plymouth this year. We have one in Concord at the State House. The hearings go on for 8 hours
Now,
sometimes.
are those hearings exactly the same as if you went to Concord to
Yes,
attend a hearing?
yes.
So that would be, you would hear from whom? You would hear from
It's
local
open to the public.
administration people,
Nope,
public
it's open
people?
to the public. The hearing goes out just like any other hearing at the State House. It's open to the public to come and comment on the budget. And as I said, the hearing in Concord this year, I think, lasted for 8 hours. The hearings that are in the districts, out in the things, are a little less time frame. But basically, we make the commitment, we set the time, we stay until the last person testifies. We usually put a time limit and ask for people that they have 5 minutes or whatever, so we don't
Now, do
have
you
it 2
guys
days.
grill these members of the public like you would grill a
Generally not.
department?
Generally not. When we do the public hearings on the budget, we don't. When we do separate hearings, there are also separate bills that come to finance that mostly are incorporated into the budget. And on those, we will ask questions. When it goes to, there's the big hearings in front of the whole committee. We also have hearings in front of the divisions. More often, the questions and the grilling will come when the hearings are in front of the divisions. So when you came and testified on the whole budget, for instance, I'll take an issue. There was funding, for instance, for I'll try to take on say the alcohol and drug fund. Which is an issue this year in the budget. When the entire budget hearing was going on, a number of people came and testified. There were very few, if any, questions to each of those individuals. But when it came to my division, Division 3, in Health and Human Services, and people came in and testified to the more minutia of how it will be funded, what level, what percent from a certain fund, that was when we asked more questions. That was when the grilling began. When the process was how we would do that, the fine-tuning of the language, and the experts came in from the department or from the providers or from the lobbyists, then we would ask the more detailed questions.
Does
And
the Finance Committee rely as much on lobbyists as the other committees do? Because my experience is that the committees generally treat lobbyists as their experts.
I wouldn't say we treat them as the experts always. A lot of times, it's the, and I think we have to define lobbyists. Lobbyists are not always, and people I think assume the lobbyists are
Orange badges.
Orange badges, but they're different kinds. There's the lobbyists that come from the corporate interest, shall you say. There's also the lobbyists from the nonprofits. A lobbyist quite often are people from the drug and alcohol treatment centers that are nonprofits that are coming in, or it's the volunteers are quite often lobbyists. So there's different levels of lobbyists, and yeah, they bring us expert testimony, but they also sometimes are coming in and being challenged or giving us opinions. So yeah, we rely on them a great deal because remember, we don't have a lot of staff, but
Right, this
the
is New
finance,
Hampshire, you know.
but also the finance committee does have a little more staff than the other committees. So in many ways, we don't rely on them as much because while they bring us certain facts, we have the staff with the legislative budget assistants that can verify a lot more information. So we do rely on them, but not as much as, say, with Bob's committee in Science and Tech, you don't have the staffing that can verify sometimes. You have to verify it yourself.
That's right.
Where we can turn, as I said, the Legislative Budget Assistance Office is the most miraculous hidden secret
And
in
they're
state
really
government.
professional people.
They're professional
and
people.
fast, too. They can
Right.
turn
Oh,
around questions
right.
very quickly.
And they're the ones that do all the state audits, for instance, so they
Yeah.
seek out a lot of this information. So it's a little different there.
Yeah. Well, we're being told by Brian it's time to take our first break.
Oh, that's hard to
But,
do. I'm learning so much. I feel like
I
I'm in
talk a
school.
lot.
This is
Sorry
great.
about that.
I'm learning stuff.
is excellent.
My goodness, I should have had this primer myself. It's excellent, Kathy. And we're going to get into the meat of the budget, of course. But it's important to remember that this is the first year of our 2-year term, our first session. This is the session when all this work goes in, and the budget has to be done by the end of this month. And the big vote on the budget is tomorrow, and it's apparently going to be quite close. And it's going to make many changes that will affect us all, and we want to talk about that. If you want to call in, 640-3091, and we always welcome participation. And we're taking a break, but we'll be right back. We're back with the next segment of this week's progress report here on the summer solstice, June 21st, 2017, and we're very, very grateful that Kathy Rogers came down from Concord to talk with us very knowledgeably about the process by which New Hampshire is about to get its budget, or maybe not, depending on what happens tomorrow.
Yeah, I mean,
And
we've seen
the-
some wild and woolly times when it comes to voting on this budget in the process so far.
This is about, for the biennium, it's pretty close to a $12 billion figure we're talking about, all in for the.
Depends who you ask.
It depends who you ask, too. A little less, but there's
little
some
more.
questions about that, and Kathy can talk about that. And it's, I think, very important to remember that I think about 30% of that money comes from federal funds. There's an awful lot of things that we do in the state for which we have to depend on federal funding. And, given
So
the
that means-
turmoil in Washington, who knows how secure all that is, but that's a
That means we have to
big
pay
issue.
attention to federal budgets too, because they could
We
impact
absolutely
what we see
do.
here on the ground. Boy, you'd
Yeah.
never think that government would have a part in people's lives. Holy cow. Who knew?
By the way, if they want to shrink the federal government, there's not going to be just the Democratic states that are going to be up in arms if they take away, because every state depends on federal funding for a big chunk of its operations. Every state does.
If they wanted to shrink government, that would be fine if my taxes went down, but my taxes don't go down. It's these very wealthy people whose taxes go down
Yeah.
at the expense of everybody else. That's what we got to be looking at. But anyway, I'm getting off track. Sorry, Bob.
Okay, so we have a real expert here in Kathy Rogers. She's been paying very much attention to this, first as a member of the Finance Committee, and although she wasn't on the Conference Committee, which has dealt with this issue and is going to bring us forward their agreement tomorrow.
Can I jump in and ask a question before we get going? It's because the House did not pass a budget.
Yeah.
So why was there a conference committee? I thought the idea of a conference committee was so that the two bills could be reconciled. But if
Yeah.
there
Little
was no
trick.
bill,
How
There
about
was a
that? For
little
the
trick.
first time in anybody's memory, the House of Representatives, the usual pattern is, as Kathy mentioned, the governor submits a budget fairly shortly after his inauguration, after his inauguration in this case.
and it's a money bill, so it's
It's a
got to
money
start in the
bill,
House.
and it's got to start in the House. That's constitutional. And then the House has a budget, and then the final crack is taken by the Senate. This year, for the first time anybody can remember, the House passed no budget. Now, as far as I can tell, I want you to talk about this, how unusual this was. Didn't make a bit of difference. Why?
There was a little trick. What the Senate did by agreement is the Senate took two bills that had passed the Finance Committee and were finance bills and turned them in to House Bill 1 and House Bill 2, which is the budget bill and the trailer bill. So they, in effect, became the budget bills. And
How
then
can the Senate do
builds
that?
The House. The Senate can do whatever it wants.
Is that so?
Yes. The Senate, under their rules, can make those bills the budget bills and the trailer bills, which is what they did with
Oh, no
agreement
kidding.
with the House.
So now, all of a sudden,
Right.
presto
So-
changeo, you need a conference.
So
Now,
they
whether
became.
that's consistent with what the authors of our Constitution had in mind when they wrote it,
Well, but
who knows?
the Constitution didn't necessarily say what the budget bill would be. It said all money bills have to originate
Yeah.
there. So it was a fine line, and it was an agreement that was worked out between
Okay.
all the parties. That's how.
All the parties?
Well, all the parties in power, shall we say. So
That's a
that there
very
could be-
interesting twist. I find that interesting because I'm trying to think, okay, we've seen many, many bills that come out of
We've
committee
heard the old saying
with
about two things you
recommendation.
never want to watch made: sausage and lard.
We understand
So,
that. We understand that.
That was how we came about with this.
Okay.
And that's when the conference committee came about, because on these two
So
bills.
they had a straw man bill.
Right.
and
there
I'm
was
sure they
not
knocked it down,
agreement. Right. And there was not agreement. And what happened is there was actually not
Oh.
a vote of the House not to concur, which is the term. And we were in recess during the time and when you're in recess, the Speaker can decide to not concur. And so when we were in recess, or not in German, but not in session, because there was a concern, my understanding is there was concern by the House leadership that the more right wing of their party would not go along with a vote of not concurring. So that's when the decision was made by the House leadership to not concur while we were in
Holy
recess.
cow! This is a
Thereby
real
they-
sausage. This one. This.
Right, and thereby they formed a conference committee.
Okay.
And while I wasn't on the conference committee, I was not one of the named conferees, I was at every session of
That's
the
what I
conference.
understand, which
And
is
there were a few of us.
going above and beyond.
the House Democrats that serve on the Finance Committee, almost all of us that serve on the Finance Committee went to and attended all of the meetings. And we work very closely together, the members of the Democratic House Finance Committee, and we consulted with, our only named member was Mary Jane Wallner was the only named member. We had some alternates, but we worked very much as a team. So we worked together during that conference committee to advise, work with. All of us have various parts of the budget that we are more, are kind of more specialists on. So we were there to work with her on it.
Yep. So the vote's tomorrow.
Yes.
Are you going to be voting for the budget?
I will not. And I think that you will find the majority of the Democratic members will most likely not be voting for it, as will a large number, we understand, of the so-called Freedom Caucus. I understand they took a vote by a very close margin that I think it was a 2-vote margin they decided they would support, but a huge number of them will not be supporting it. And it's for very different reasons that both
bet.
Two things you both brought up, though, that are interesting. As you said, it's close to $12 million. It's actually $11.7 billion budget, according to the Senate President and the Speaker of the House. That's somewhat of a misnomer. And then you spoke about federal funds. The reason I say it's a misnomer, there's an excess of $300 million that is off budget. And when I say off budget, those excess of $300 million will not be on the line of the budget. That's not included in this $11.7, $12 billion, because those monies will not go through the budget. They will go through the fiscal committee. The fiscal committee is 10 people.
Which runs the budget over the course
Right.
of years until the
And
next budget's adopted.
That's what it originally was founded, but it meets monthly now, even when we're in session. It was supposed to come about to a group of individual legislators that would be there when we're out of session. But it now meets monthly, and it does all the acceptance of federal monies that come through so that they can take it off budget and say to the very conservative members, oh, see how little spending we have. So they can take that and push it aside and say, oh, it's only 11.7.
And they actually trick these people who don't realize that that's happening?
To some of them, yes.
Come on.
There was an amendment that was put forth in the budget this year that didn't pass from Mary Jane Wallner and David Bates, who's a very conservative member, and Mary Jane is a Democratic member, to be more transparent. Governor Lynch, when he was governor, stopped doing this, and the Democrats have had a tradition of not doing this. Senator Morris likes doing this, so they have done this. But
He's a
there's
Senate president, as
Right,
you probably
but
know.
there's some funds, and that's one of the things that we're concerned about, as is the very conservative members. So that's when you
So
have
when you
both
talk
ends
about the
together.
all-in, which was the term Bob used, you need to take this 11.7, but you also need to take this off-budget spending, because that
Exactly.
money's going to be spent. It's
Right.
going to be put into
Yes.
line items.
So if you're concerned about the level of spending and what it is in regards to the level of inflation,
Which
you
would
need
be
to add
important
in.
to these right-wing Freedom
Correct.
Caucus people. That's
And it's
really
also
their
important,
mantra.
frankly, to a lot of people such as myself who want transparency in the budgeting and be honest about things. So those are two things you spoke about with the federal spending and the transparency. The second thing you talked about is tax cuts for the wealthy. That's a big issue to a lot of us. This budget extends and grows the business tax cuts that we started 2 years ago. The tax cuts that we started 2 years ago, just continuing them, or the additional tax cuts this year, are going to add in $20 million loss in revenues. If we add those to the tax cuts we've already got, and you look out exponentially to the year 2021, it's going to amount to about $208 million that we're going to lose in revenues over the course of those years. We're going to lose them in a time when we have economic growth, where we have the biggest problem we've heard from all kinds of economic experts, from the business community and so forth, who's, by the way, not asking for these tax cuts. The business
Yeah,
community.
that's the other thing that I've heard. When the BIA, a very conservative organization, when they poll their members, you know, what's the most important issue? It's infrastructure, education.
Workforce development.
Workforce
Right.
development. It's not, oh, geez, you know, if only I could get out from under these
Exactly.
heavy taxes we have here in New Hampshire.
And so what does this budget do? It does these tax cuts. They eliminated the one program that was workforce development. That's gone. And the program that was workforce development was all funded with TANF funds, which are federal funds, which are a surplus of funds. So we took away the workforce program that the business community wanted that was being funded with free money or money that was already
Well,
there.
it's money that we've sent to Washington. We're just
Right.
getting it back. It's not
Right.
free money.
Exactly.
Because we only get about 75, 76
But it's
cents
money
back
that
on the dollar.
it's money that we have. And
And
instead,
deserve.
we're giving tax cuts for money we don't have, and that money we won't have for the next coming years, and that when these tax cuts come about, it's going to hamstring us to do other programs we need, like funding the opiate crisis, like funding mental health, like funding developmental disabilities, like funding education.
Now, the last three things you just mentioned, there have been court cases where we
Correct.
are under court order or agreement that things have to be done.
Correct.
So how can the legislature, in good conscience, in good faith, defy the court orders? Is that the intent?
Well,
we're just
on
let
mental
them
health-
enforce their own judgments?
On mental health, that court case and the settlement was not linked to financial numbers. It was linked to results. So
Which is not a
this-
bad thing.
No, that's a good way to do it. But on mental health, for instance, this budget does fund some additional funding. And it's questionable about whether it will be enough or not. It's not funded to the level the governor requested. It's less than that. For instance, the governor had requested some ACT teams, which are mobile teams to respond. It does not fund a juvenile ACT team, for instance. It funds one additional team, not the three that he'd requested. It also does not fund rate increases for worker providers out there. And we're having additional growing problems with not only recruitment of workers, but retention. So the question is, if we continue to lose people by not retaining them, and we can't recruit new people, who's going to provide these services?
And the funding is bare bones for
Right.
those people who provide
Exactly.
those minimal services.
They get
It's-
very little pay
yeah,
to begin
it's-
with. So
it's-
that's the question of, while the settlement isn't tied to the funds, if we can't retain workers and we can't recruit new ones, will it
How are you gonna
off
get the
the
results?
balance? Right. So no one can say, maybe we will be all right, but who can say? On the developmental disabilities, there are additional monies. Yes, there's 57 million additional, but the wait list is still going to grow exponentially. And so the question that many of us have is it funded enough? I don't believe it is, and I believe that we could have funded it at a
That
higher
sounds
level.
like arithmetic to me, though. If the wait list is growing, then the answer is no, it's not funded enough.
True.
If the list is shrinking but not fast enough, now we have a debate.
But the people that are proposing that we support this say, well, we've given it more. So therefore, you have the difference of opinion.
What about the thing my partner, Earl Carroll, that works on mental health issues? He does the involuntary admissions hearings up at the state hospital and has for a long time. And, he knows and we know that there are these people in mental health crisis being stashed in emergency rooms in various hospitals, including here in Manchester. Is the funding in place to meet their needs without having them in inappropriate places
There is
for
money
days?
for some additional beds,
Yeah.
but there's not, some of us feel there's not enough. And that's why these mobile ACT teams were one way of responding to that as well.
Yeah.
And a lot of people in the community feel that that's a stronger way than just additional beds to deal with it.
Yeah.
And the governor's budget originally had three teams, I guess, and this just funds one.
Yeah.
So that's one place we think that there's a problem.
Would additional
other-
beds and additional ACT teams be such an outrageous idea?
No, it wouldn't. I mean, that's one area that there's never going to be enough money that we need to do, and that's why the additional money for workers and the rate increases was important, because you need, part of it, what you need is the trained professionals to deal with it.
Isn't
It's
New
a
Hampshire the
combination.
wealthiest state in the United States of America? You just said there's never going to be enough money, and that just
Right.
But wait a minute, if there ever would be, it would be in New Hampshire,
Right.
right?
Well,
Because
that's-
we have the most money per
that's-
Well,
capita.
we're in the top few. I'm not sure we're the wealthiest, but per capita, aren't we? We're
Yeah,
in
we're
the top
very high.
3 or 4.
Well, that's kind of the argument that.
So it
that
sounds to me
as
like
are
we
the
have
tax-
very selfish, wealthy people who don't want to help people with mental health issues and who don't
Well, I
want to
think-
help people who have these problems. I'm sorry I'm being harsh, but
Oh, you're not. I mean, I think you look at your state senator here in Manchester, Lou D'Alessandro, who served on the Senate Budget Committee, and he made a statement that was basically, I think he said here, I've got it, in a period of economic growth, we're doing better than we have in years. We have a crying need for workforce development, we deny it. We have a crying need for mental health, and we deny it. We have a higher group, and he went on. We are
I
doing
mean,
the
I
tax
remember
cuts for
in
the wealthy instead
2008,
of anything
2009,
else.
2010, everything was tanking, and there really wasn't a lot of money around, but I
And it's
don't,
something that the business community has not asked for, and yet
Yeah.
we're doing it. That's the thing it
They
doesn't
may
make
not
a
have
lot of
asked for it, but
sense.
they'll take it if we give it to them.
The other thing that's alarming in this budget is the Alcohol and Drug Fund. There's an Alcohol and Drug Governor's Commission on Alcohol and Drug Fund that by statute is supposed to be funded at 5% of liquor profits. that come out. We've not funded it at 5% for years. Every year we repeal that statute and lower it. In the last budget, we lowered it to 1.7%.
Oh, my
This
gracious.
budget does a 3.4, which, yes, is an increase. And they will tell you, the people proposing that we vote for this budget, oh, this is a huge increase, this is great. Unfortunately, they're not quite right. In the special session we had a year ago, we increased a huge amount and went to basically 3.4. So this budget is level funding it. I had an amendment to the budget that we didn't pass that would have brought it to that 5%. Because we have a crisis. We need to fund this. And it's not just a crisis. We hear about the opioid crisis, but we also have a crisis in alcohol, frankly. People are killing themselves every day with alcohol consumption. And that's a serious. New Hampshire is one of the highest rates of alcoholism in the country.
When you have a state where the alcohol is so tightly regulated at state liquor stores, there is this obligation, I believe.
Oh.
The same obligation if you're going to put in a casino. You have to provide a lot of money from that
Yeah.
casino to take care of the people you're going to harm.
Well, I prosecuted DUIs for years. It drives me crazy that you come out of the toll booth and you see, '08 kills, liquor store next right. But, just drove me crazy. But we do have a crisis.
I'm with you on that.
And,
but we have an obligation. If we're going to be
exactly.
peddling the stuff, we have to
should
take
be
care of the
doing-
people that we
and
harm in doing so.
5% is not a huge effort. I think we should do it.
And we've
but
never
we-
funded it anywhere close to that, have
One
we?
year we did.
We did that.
We did 1 year. The first year I think it was put
Yeah.
in, but we're not having a huge increase. We're basically level funding it, and everybody's patting themselves on the back with it. But this year, besides not funding it at the 5%, this budget will set a precedent that I think is horribly dangerous. This is the first time we're going to divert funds from there to something else. And it's a good cause, but we're still diverting it. This budget calls for us to divert monies and allows the governor that with the Sununu Center, we're going to put an alcohol and drug crisis center for juveniles, which is good, at the Sununu Center. We need it, it's a good thing. But this budget will allow that if there's not enough money for the operations of that, we can divert money for operations of the Sununu Center from the Alcohol and Drug Fund. Now, as I said, that's a good thing, it's a good cause, but still,
So,
Just
so
not
it's a
to do it.
diversion.
not limited, so I understand, so those funds would not be limited to the juvenile drug and alcohol
No,
program?
it's for-
They could be used for
Yes.
fixing a roof?
It can be used for operational stuff there. And while it's a good cause, it's a great cause, it still would be the first precedent of diverting monies from that fund
Yeah, that's been the
to
whole
something
point
else.
of New Hampshire budgeting, is to try to find dedicated
Right.
funds for programs, because we have such a
Yes. And I
real
know,
patchwork of
and I know
tax
there are a lot of
structure.
people that object to dedicated funds. I understand that. If you object to dedicated funds, okay, but there's another way to do
Well,
it
but there's
than to
policy.
diverting.
It's a
right.
policy, though. It's
But
it's been
diverting
decided.
funds from this, I think, is a dangerous, dangerous precedent. Because what will happen in 2 years from now in the next budget, they'll say, well, we did this before. Let's take the money, because what's the old saying? Was it the bank robber that said, why do you steal money from the bank? Because it's there. They'll look at this
Willie
fund.
Sutton's famous
That's
quote.
it.
Why
They'll
do you
look at-
rob banks? That's where the money
Right.
is.
The Finance Committee will look at this fund and they'll take it for something else. I've seen it. It happens with funds all the time.
Yeah.
They will take that money for something else. And they'll say, we did it 2 years ago. So once we set the precedent, it's there. And I think that's really dangerous. And because the drug and alcohol will always be a problem in New Hampshire, as long as we peddle alcohol, as long as we have drugs, it's going to be a problem. So that's a really dangerous precedent. That's another reason that this budget is something that we can't pass.
Well, it's worse than I thought, Bob.
Yeah. Well, we've got a real expert here. We're glad to have her. We're going to take our last break right now, folks. We'll be right back. And when we come back, I think one of the things I'd like to talk about is kindergarten, because that's a big issue here in the city of Manchester, and we can talk about that. You may be surprised to learn that's not part of the budget. But Kathy Rogers will explain that too, and what are the chances that Manchester will get the 2 million plus that we thought we were going to get to support our existing full-day kindergarten program. We'll be right back, folks. Hey, we're back, folks. This is the progress report for this Wednesday, June 21st. And if you haven't been with us but are tuning in now, we are very pleased to have with us Kathy Rogers, a member of the Finance Committee, a longtime member of the House of Representatives.
Who's conducting a doctoral level seminar on budgeting.
And she's telling us in very clear, precise terms what this budget really is about and why she and I are not going to be voting for it. And I think we'll be joined by most of the Democrats. There's going to be quite a dramatic vote tomorrow because, as we've said on this program before, the Republicans really have two parties now. They have the sort of the regular Republicans with the Speaker sort of as their leader, and then they have the so-called Freedom Caucus, who are people that don't go along with the ordinary Republican caucus on many things, and they may not go along, or many of them may not go along with the budget because they think the budget is too high a level, and Democrats, as Kathy's been clearly explaining, think it leaves critical needs unserved and sets damaging precedents. So let's continue. And you mentioned during the break that one of the things you wanted to talk about is something that, as far as I can tell, has nothing to do with raising money or spending money. Well, maybe indirectly spending money, but the local version of the Hyde Amendment. What's the Hyde Amendment, and why is it in the budget?
There's two provisions that are alarming with that had no public hearing, no debate, no discussion, just were put in the last minute on a whim, if you will. The Hyde Amendment is a federal amendment to the federal budget that calls for no federal funding goes to any organization that will provide abortions. It's in state law, if you will, here as well. We do not provide money for abortions. And there is funding that goes for various women's health causes and so forth, and for family planning. What was done at the last minute in the Senate budget is Senator Daniels put in a amendment that was basically a state version of the Hyde Amendment that said, codified into the budget, that there would be no funding for any organization that provided abortions. And then when it came to the conference committee, he asked to have that put in. The Senate demanded it be put in there. And that is in this budget. We object to that for a number of reasons. First of all, because there was no public hearing. Every other part of the budget, in one form or another, had public hearing, had people's rights to comment on it, to make suggestions, to at least comment, be clear to the public. That's the New Hampshire tradition. We do not do amendments that don't have public hearings. It's just something we don't do in New Hampshire. There's a second provision that was put in, also under same circumstances, that calls for no monies will be given or awarded to any organization that doesn't go through a bidding process on family planning. Now, again, it was targeted only to family planning. Very discriminatory. These don't go to, or no family planning can go to anyone that provides abortions, again, here, without bidding kind of thing. Only targeted towards women, first of all. Men don't have abortions. So that it's clearly targeted towards women's health. Also, no public hearing on it, no comment, and so forth. The concern there was this was targeted towards one particular organization. It was targeted towards Planned Parenthood in a very vindictive kind of way. The concern there is that Planned Parenthood actually provides women's health care services for a large portion of the rural part of the state, specifically in the north
they're huge
and
in
in
the
the
North
western
Country.
and the western part of the state. If you take them out of the equation, who's going to provide that? Is it going to be an organization that actually does the full array of services, pap smears, mammograms, other things that they do, cervical cancer reports? They provide a great deal of services, and they do not ask for funding, government funding of any abortions. Yes, they do provide that service, but they do not seek federal funding or state funding for that. And the worry is that if we start providing those kind of amendments into a budget document like that, it's making political statements into a document. And as you mentioned, the budget is a policy statement, yes, but it's not a political statement for someone to put in their own personal political views at the last minute without any kind of public
hearing,
comment on
yeah.
it, a hearing. The other provision that's a similar kind of thing, there was a provision put in again by one member of the House at the last minute, mainly Representative Kirk, on the Medicaid expansion, Medicaid expansion is not in the budget. That's something that we deal with next year, supposedly. It provides health care for 54,000 people in the state. There was a provision put in at the last minute on the conference committee to require a work requirement for this, something that was turned down by the federal agency that has to do this last
These are
year.
sick people.
Yes. But it's health care for 54,000
Yeah.
people. What the requirement does, though, if this budget passes, is if the federal government, one person in the federal government that makes the decision, turns down this waiver, then a letter will have to be sent out to the 54,000 people in New Hampshire that are getting their health care through this right now, telling them that in January of 2018, their health care will end. Now, the House will then have to vote on it, or the fiscal committee will deal with it. But one person in Washington is going to tell New Hampshire, not 424 people that will vote on it, one person in Washington is going to make the decision for us.
How does that amendment make that happen? I think
What
I
it
might have
words,
not followed.
what it words is that if we are requesting a waiver to have a work requirement on Medicaid,
Oh,
okay?
I see.
So
Okay.
if the federal government does not allow that waiver, which it has not in the past, so the likelihood is they will not again.
But because it's in the budget, it's part of
And
New
if
Hampshire
they,
law.
and if they don't do it, that we will end Medicaid expansion. So that way,
Devastating consequences.
one person in Washington makes the decision, not 424
And that-
elected
that's Neil Kirk.
representations.
That's got Neil Kirk written
One
all over
person,
it.
Representative Kirk put that in the budget. So we're going to let one person, one bureaucrat in Washington make the decision, not the 424 legislators that you all elect.
Yeah.
So we're turning over that power to people that supposedly we want all our elected officials to make the decision, but instead, one bureaucrat in Washington's
Well,
going to.
Neil Kirk doesn't like the Medicaid expansion, and he wants to kill it.
I'll
Now-
tell you something else he doesn't like. Kindergarten. I don't think he likes
Yeah,
kindergarten.
you did want to turn
Or
to that.
Keno. And we have something now called Keno Garden.
And I learned what Keno is last
We
week,
learned
right here
with
on the
Keno.
show.
We're gonna have a field trip and try it out. But we were very excited in Manchester when we thought, because Manchester is one of many New Hampshire communities, and certainly
It
the
does.
largest community, that does provide full-day kindergarten as part of our public education process.
Absolutely vital.
Absolutely
component
vital.
of the education system here in this
As the book
community.
used to say, everything I needed to know I learned in kindergarten.
Right.
And having kids ready to learn starting grade one.
Not to mention the other services like meals and everything else
Yeah.
that these kids get through these programs.
Yeah, it's so important. And we actually upped the budget for our school department, school district, by $2 million, partly with the idea that because the governor wanted to have full-day kindergarten, he's been very clear on that, and we agree with him, that we would be reasonably confident that we were going to get additional state funding to help us fund our schools. Now, where are we at? And why isn't this part of the budget?
That's a hard one. It was taken out of the budget and put in a separate bill. It left finance, the House Finance Committee, with Keno as it had to, in order to get out of finance, there had to be a funding mechanism attached to it. So Keno was offered as a funding mechanism. However, it wasn't tethered, if you will, to Keno at the time. They were separate in that it didn't have to be funded, but it was offered as a mechanism. When it went to the Committee of Conference, through the process, and again, it was one of those sausage kind of things, it became tethered, is my understanding. And now
So
there's...
it is the funding mechanism if we're going to have full-day
Yeah,
kindergarten.
the money still goes into the Education Trust Fund, but it's a large part of that funding. There's a $1,100 grant to each district.
Per pupil.
Yeah, per pupil, whereas the governor originally had $1,800 per pupil, is my understanding. So there's somewhat of a shortfall there. There's all kinds of problems and questions. I think, as you know, the old saying is if you have two lawyers look at something, they'll come up with three different opinions, and that seems to be that with there. There are many people, attorneys that have looked at this, including Andy Valinsky, who was the original Claremont attorney, that thinks that it's unconstitutional
Yeah.
because it's a different form of funding depending on what grade you are,
And
basically,
he's
as
been
a student.
outspoken
Right.
on that.
So there's questions about the constitutionality of it. There's questions about if it's full adequacy. There's all kinds of questions on this.
And there's another question too, Kathy, because I understand it. This Keno, before it becomes a reality, has to be approved
By each area.
each municipality.
Correct, exactly.
And the
even-
towns can't approve it till they have their town meeting next
Right.
year. The city,
So
of
it
course,
wouldn't take
can, because
effect
we have a
until,
governing
yeah,
council.
the earliest it would
But-
take effect for most places would not be until next year.
And if-
and
if-
if it
and if-
would raise enough revenue.
And
is the
who
other
knows how
question.
many communities are going to welcome this? Maybe,
Right.
maybe many of them won't, and then we don't have the revenue.
Okay,
that's-
can I ask a question? Suppose some towns, I don't know, let's pick on Candia. They decide, you know what, we don't want this in our town. Do they still get the revenue for their kindergarten?
I don't know the answer to that. To be very blunt, I don't know the answer to that.
You know, because I can just imagine,
I thought the answer was
I think they do,
could,
but, yeah.
but would the revenues be sufficient for them to get it, or would they have to share? I mean, if Candia is not alone, and there's many Candias and many towns bigger
Well,
than
that's what I can
Candia.
see. You
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
Manchester, Concord, and Nashua are going to be paying for everybody's kindergarten.
And the other question, the other thing that's come up is there is another bill that is another kindergarten bill that has been retained. But the question is, would the speaker rule that it was a similar bill so it couldn't come in?
Retain meaning the committee holds
The
onto it so
committee
they can
has
come
got
back
it
to
so
it
they
next
could
year.
come back, yeah. I've heard it said that the chairman of the education committee said, if this bill dies, that one won't come forward. But again, that's rumor and conjecture, so I don't know. So there seems to be more questions about this, and people are torn. I've, at different times, you know, if you ask me what time of day, I'll give you a different answer about whether I'm going to vote for it. That's how torn I am back and forth. I can tell you the original sponsor of this bill, Senator Feltus, who is my state senator in Concord, has come out strongly against it. He thinks that it is unconstitutional the way it's done, and he thinks we're better to scrap it and come back again. He feels very strongly about it. And it's
Boy,
not that he has a
that's
problem
quite a
with
statement.
Keno.
I mean, he's-
Right.
It's quite a statement, and he's a very, very excellent senator.
And I don't have
Very
a problem
hardworking.
with Keno. My real problem with this is tethering any bill to one particular revenue source. I find problematic, whatever the source might be. It's not the gambling that doesn't bother me. It's tethering it to any particular source, which keeps troubling to me. But again, many of us look at it and say, well, we really want the full day kindergarten. Is this the best chance we've got? You know, many people are saying it'll be at least 5 years before we have a chance again.
Yeah, I'm going
looking
to just
at
bring
it.
up
So-
again, New Hampshire is in the top 5 wealthiest per capita states in the country, and we're hat in hand begging for our kids to have kindergarten.
And that, it all comes back to the reason I say 5 years is if this budget passes with these tax cuts, keep in mind, I said $208 million by 2021, that we'll be behind the 8 ball of revenues we lost. So the next legislature, if this budget passes, is going to have to deal with that amount of money of revenues we don't have. So that's
And
why
there we
it's
have
5
it.
years.
That's the bottom line.
Yeah. Well, we're almost to the end of our time. It's gone very fast. Any closing thoughts or any other things that you want to mention from your knowledge of the budget that we haven't touched on?
I would just say that there's a lot of people that'll be hurt by this budget, and if you can, call your legislator and ask them to just say no.
Yeah.
Good
Those
advice.
those revenues we're giving up, what was it, more than 200 million by the year 2021?
208 million by
208
2021.
million.
And
They're not going to be easy to get back, because believe me, folks, the anti-tax fervor is very strong. Once we lower these taxes, or one case we're eliminating a tax, those revenues are probably gone for a long time.
Your phone calls to your legislators will make a difference.
Yes, they
If
will.
you come from the district, they will listen. Make that phone call. It's very important.
Yep. And thanks for coming in, Kathy.
Thank you. It's fun.
You were certainly educated me, and I think Mike as well as
Oh,
I
yeah.
hope some people out there watching the show. And we will be back next week with another edition of the Progress Report.
See you next week, folks.